Welcome to Night Talks, the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications talk show, produced by students for students. I'm Sam Olenek, a graduate student studying mass communications, and our guest today is Ken Schwencke, a CJC graduate who worked for the independent Florida Alligator, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and now he's editor of the news apps team at ProPublica. Hey Ken, thank you so much for being here today.
Hi Sam, thanks for having me.
Of course. So I want to get started by going back in time a little bit to 2009 when you graduated from the University of Florida with your bachelor's degree in journalism. Did you always want to go into this field?
No. I thought I was going to do computer science, and then I got to the University of Florida and I got, two printouts, one the computer science curriculum and one the journalism curriculum. And the journalism curriculum looked like a lot more fun. And so I decided to work to study at the journalism school. About halfway into working here or to studying here, Professor Mindy McAdams came into a class and said, hey, print newspapers aren't doing so well anymore. If you have computer programming skills, you'll be a very valuable sort of person in the market. And so I started dusting off my computer programming skills and working on the sort of more data side of things.
How did you work on the computer programming skills? Was it like classes that you took or on your own?
I took some time and I built a crime map of Gainesville. Crime maps were all the rage at the time in the data journalism world. So I built a little thing that would scrape the Gainesville Police Department website every couple of minutes and then build a crime map of Gainesville.
This was like all on your own?
Yeah, I was bored.
That's pretty cool. How did the time at the College of Journalism and Communications and the independent Florida Alligator prepare you for your career?
Yeah, I got a lot of great sort of baseline reporting knowledge from the College of Journalism. They didn't have a lot of advanced sort of data, or like web programming classes, but they had a few, and I took all of them. And, the last class, my capstone course, was one where I basically just got to sit in, one of the rooms here for hours on end and build web apps. And that was super, super helpful to kind of just get some real world time to like just build stuff. And at the Alligator, you're running a daily newspaper with everybody else, and you're sort of trying to figure out the online presentation. And so it was a really good practical experience in kind of how the news works.
So you kind of got the best of both worlds doing your computer programming and journalism stuff.
Exactly.
Well, that's awesome. When you went to work for the Los Angeles Times as a data graphics reporter, what kind of stories did you cover?
Yeah, I did a number of things. I worked on the homicide report for a lot of the time that I was there, which was a project that was initially started as kind of a blog that would track any murder within LA County. There was no real good way of doing this, and a reporter there had started working on this, and my team ended up taking it over and turning it into kind of an interactive database that I then worked on off and on for the whole time that I worked there. And then I built a little bot at the LA Times called QuakeBot that would automatically report anytime there was an earthquake in the area, which is really cool.
Did you get to pick these topics on your own? Did you have like freedom with that?
It was a mix. I started as an intern. You don't get to pick a lot of things as an intern. But, as I started going, I started finding my spots and some things that I was interested in.
Was crime one of those things?
Yeah, I think, crime is interesting from a data perspective for a number of reasons. One is like, there's a lot of data about crime, and so you can like help people sort of visualize like trends and things like that. On the flip side, the data is sometimes not good, and the data is sort of reliant on the police to actually like track and report crime correctly. And so it's sort of a compromised data set in and of itself. And it's also only, of course, like where police have gone and actually like written stuff down and not actually maybe where crime occurs. So I've always been sort of interested in probing that.
So how is data an important tool for journalists and storytellers?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of times when you're out in the field, you hear anecdotes about things that are happening. And one thing that data can do and data analysis can do is kind of tell you whether that thing is actually happening as much as people think it is or not. which is not to say it's not a problem if it's not happening as much as people think it is. Crime, I think, is actually one of those interesting examples. I live in New York City. There has been the mayor of New York City has said there's a lot of crime, a huge increase in crime. And while there has been a pretty decent proportional increase in crime from the past few years, it's still far below, what it was even 10 years ago. And so when you kind of look at it, the measure of crime is much lower than people's sort of experience of it. And once you know that, you can kind of investigate why people may be feeling that way. The other thing about data that is really interesting, besides sort of confirming or, disputing what people say on the ground, is you can do data analysis and then take that analysis and pinpoint where things are happening. So we worked on a project at ProPublica where we analyzed data about toxic air that industrial plants are emitting all over the country. And we didn't just analyze that and put out those findings. We then sent reporters to all of these hotspots to ask people. And a lot of the people who went down there, they hadn't been talked to by a reporter or anybody from the EPA or anybody, like that before. And they were like, this makes so much sense. My aunt, my mother, my cousin, we all have this same kind of cancer, and we've all been wondering what that is. And you're telling me that there's this chemical in the air that causes cancer in this area. And that upsets me, that, really, really sort of goes with what we've been sort of experiencing on the ground. And you can sort of take this data and pinpoint places to find and tell these stories.
So it kind of helps to connect the dots a little bit to what people are saying and almost kind of not fact check, but maybe proofread some of it in a way.
It's ground proofing, right? You could, here's a really good example actually. So that same data set basically said that Boeing was poisoning a good part of Portland, right? Which would have been huge news, very surprising to lots of people. When we went out there, we couldn't find anything that seemed to indicate that. People around there didn't think that that was necessarily happening. We weren't sort of running into a lot of people who said they were having trouble, with cancer. I mean, more than anybody does. And when we really probed and started asking Boeing, at first they wouldn't talk to us, and we said, hey, we're going to tell you that you're causing, huge cancer, problems within Portland. They were like, wait, let us check the data that we've been reporting to the federal government. And it turned out that they had just been reporting incorrect data to the federal government, and they hadn't been checking it that whole time. So once they went back and they revised the data that they've been putting in, which they have to submit to the federal government under perjury, so we're pretty sure they weren't, hopefully weren't lying this time, that cancer cluster, or that sort of cluster of toxic air went away out of our data. And that was a way that we could check our data analysis using sort of on-the-ground reporting.
After you moved to the New York Times, after the Los Angeles Times, as an interactive news developer, tell us about that experience.
Yeah, it was really exciting to work for the New York Times. I was working at sort of a weird department. The interactive news department is sort of a weird department that straddled the business side and the editorial side of the company. And because of that, I had less opportunity to work on straight news than I wanted to. But I ended up working on a weird little bot called the Fourth Down bot, which would sort of talk about probabilities in football games, which is not my forte, but was sort of an interesting thing to work on. I ended up writing this thing that allowed people to track people as they ran the New York City Marathon in sort of a fun way. So as you were looking at the page, it would say hey, if you're at mile marker 12, clap for this person in this bib because they're passing you right now. And some data analysis and stories about that. The reason I wanted to move to ProPublica was because it was a more editorially focused job at that point. Yeah.
When you first started with ProPublica, you were a news app developer for ProPublica's Electionland. What is this project and what was your involvement?
Yeah, so Electionland was a project that we worked on in 2016 where ProPublica sort of created this giant project that involved a lot of other newsrooms all over the country. And we got access to a database from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which operate a hotline called 866 Our Vote. And so what happens is if you're having voting troubles or something like that, or you have questions about voting, you can call this hotline and a couple of other hotlines in different languages as well. And the lawyers who staff that hotline on a volunteer basis, they enter the details of your call into a database. And so what we were doing was we were pulling information out of that database and kind of I say we were kind of using the exhaust fumes of like their legal process to kind of look to see whether there were voting problems happening in 2016. Voting has only become a more contentious issue in this country since then. But at the time you had, then candidate Donald Trump saying that, he wanted people to go down to the polls and rough people up and things like that. And one of the reasons we started the project was we wanted to see whether that was happening, whether we could identify that happening in the world and then tell local reporters who had signed up with us that like, hey, you should go to this polling place because there's this problem happening right there. And that while we did tell people when there were sort of problems happening at polling places, it was never really that, right? It wasn't sort of like big, fights or things like that. It was more like workaday election issues. So like an entire, set of systems goes down, or what frequently happens is like a school gym doesn't open because somebody forgot to come in and like unlock it that day, and so nobody can come vote. And it really exposed me to like just how bizarre like the federal election system is in this country, and that really a lot of the problems when it comes to voting are not like people down at the polls, causing problems, but like really structural issues just in the way we vote.
How did you uncover stories like your piece on Cloudflare?
Yeah, so at ProPublica, I worked on another project that was sort of spiritually similar to Election Land. It was called Documenting Hate, and it was looking at the incidence of like hate and bias incidents in the country. So we had people telling us, whether they were sort of experienced a hate crime, essentially. And we weren't necessarily turning that into data, more like tips for like other reporters to follow up on, and that's why it was sort of similar to Election Land. But as I was doing that, this sounds weird to say, and I can only just say it, I was reading a lot of Nazi websites at the time, which was like part of my job, and it was super depressing, and I was sort of monitoring this sort of like extreme right-wing activity. I would not recommend doing that. But as I started looking at them, I realized they were all hosted or all sort of protected by this company called Cloudflare. And that is something, ProPublica uses Cloudflare, right? Like it's a pretty like big company that like protects websites from being attacked, but also part of what it does is it secures people from knowing who your ultimate hosting is. So like where your website is actually hosted. And it also makes it so it's impossible to sort of complain to your host that like you're doing something horrible or illegal. And so what Cloudflare was doing, what I realized at the time and sort of like looking up and researching a little bit, was that they had a policy essentially that if you complained about a website through them, they would just send the complaint to the website owner. And that website owner, in this case, like Nazis, would then like post your private information. They would like, the company would send your phone number and your email address to the Nazis, and the Nazis would take that and they would post it on the website and say, hey, go harass this person. And so I ended up calling some of those numbers because I found them on the website and talking to people who had been harassed. And then we wrote a story sort of about how Cloudflare had this policy of basically tipping off Nazis that you were upset at them. And that was, people were experiencing really, really real bad harassment, and Cloudflare ended up changing their form so that they no longer did that at the time.
Mm-hmm. So that was your goal to kind of to uncover those stories and kind of move toward policy change in some kind of way?
I don't know if I was writing it necessarily thinking that I wanted a policy change. I was just like so outraged that it was happening, and I figured other people would also be outraged. The fact that they decided to change the policy, I think, was smart and reasonable on their part. I don't know if ultimately I had that idea going into it, though it makes sense because I think that policy was indefensible.
Are there any specific steps that you take or boxes you check while investigating for a story? And when do you know that it's ready to publish?
That is a really good question. I think, you want to make sure that you've looked at a story from all sides. And like, I know that there's like a lot of like, and what I don't mean is like, you should write both sides in the sense that like, every opinion is like equally as valid on a subject, but you should really probe basically the basic assumptions that you've made about this. So if somebody tells you, as you're reporting, you should talk to people who will tell you that you're wrong, right? And while ultimately you may disagree with them, their critique will make your story stronger as long as you accept it in good faith, And so there have been many times that we have gone to people who we knew would be like, you're doing this data analysis poorly, or we don't think that this is the right thing to do, and you have them write out, and tell you in detail what their problem is with it, and you go and you report all of those problems out, and you say like, okay, this ends up being like a differing point of view more than it is like we are wrong on this. And sometimes you look at it and you're like, you know what, that person was right about this. Like, as we've sort of reported out what they've told us, like they were right about something. And so I think you should definitely take your critics seriously, as long as your critics are being serious. Not all critics are serious. And like that to me is like a really key thing, especially when you're doing investigative reporting. Also, you know, fact check. You gotta go through every piece, every fact in your story. I highlight it and then I check it off when I have gone back to my sources and checked it. And I have never once in my life not found something that I have like mistranscribed, like wrote the wrong number down because I did it from memory. And so I would like super encourage anybody to do that.
In 2018, your story Dead Named focused on how cops in Jacksonville investigate the murders of transgender women. Why are these and other LGBTQ stories important to share?
That's a good question, especially right now. I think, you know, in 2018, you know, I am a gay man. My reporting partner in this was trans, and we were sort of interested initially in just like looking up, you know, sort of looking into trans issues that, you know, may be of interest to like investigate. You know, we started thinking like, do we want to track trans murders? And like, that is something that people have done. And also like, there are some, you know, you don't only want to like track dead trans people. Like that seems like a bad thing to sort of only do. But as we were sort of like looking at that idea and sort of putting that aside, we saw a number of murders of trans women in Jacksonville, and we pulled those police reports. We pulled a lot of police reports from all over the country, and what we noticed was a really consistent pattern in the way police described trans women, which was like, you can only really describe it as like horribly transphobic. Like it was like, we came across a man in a dress, or like described it in like really sort of like ways that seemed bad, right? It just seemed like you could like hear the transphobia like on the page in the police report. And we decided to focus in on Jacksonville because there had been a number of trans murders, and some activists there had been talking to the media, and there were sort of ongoing deaths. I think another death had happened sort of around the same time that we were reporting on this. And so like that was an instance where like we had put aside an idea, but while we were like interested in this idea, we had pulled a bunch of documents, like public records, and sort of came across what the story ultimately was, we thought, which was that once we had gone down there and talked to people, they were saying like, how can you investigate this murder if you won't even like say the name of the person, you know, as they lived in their life, right? It would be like if you called me Joe and said like, does anybody know what happened to Joe? And nobody would know who Joe was, right? Because my name is Ken. And these people were not going by the names that the police were, you know, investigating them as. And like when we talked to people down there, it seemed really clear that not only was it hurting the community and sort of the community relationship with the police department, but ultimately it seemed like it was hurting the investigations as well.
Yeah, and that's, I feel like, really important because, I mean, I personally have never thought about that. So I think that's really great that you would uncover something like that. And is that where the term dead naming kind of comes from, is to not properly identify someone as they identified themselves?
Yes, it has, I don't think it has anything to do with like being murdered so much as it was like, if you use somebody's like previous name, that is called dead naming, yeah.
So now you're the editor of the news app team. What does your day-to-day work look like?
Yeah, I manage a team of 6 people, journalists who also do software development. And I mean, my day-to-day is like a lot of meetings, which is ultimately not that interesting. But the best parts of my day are developing story and project ideas with the people that I work with. And I work with a lot of really smart journalists who are really eager to like take data or like build interactive pieces that tell interesting stories or investigate problems in the world or like help hold powerful people to account. It's really nice. It's fun.
And you're actually here because your team received the University of Florida Award for Investigative Data Journalism at the 2022 Online News Association Awards for your Sacrifice Zones, Mapping Cancer-Causing Industrial Air Pollution. You mentioned that before, but what exactly did this story uncover? Yeah,
so it all had its roots in a 2019 project that we did with a paper in Louisiana through our local reporting network. And in looking at this area called Cancer Alley in Louisiana, where there are all these petrochemical plants that spew really hazardous chemicals in people, and there's like lots of identifiable cancer clusters, we, you know, one of, or 2 of the journalists on my team, Al Shaw and Layla Yunus, they pulled this data from the EPA called RISI, the Risk Screening for Environmental Indicators. And what it does is it divides the US into 810 meter by 810 meter squares. And it says for each square, what the concentration of toxic chemicals is in that square from industrial plants, what those chemicals are and where they come from, which is super cool. The thing that we had realized and the thing we used in Louisiana was that nobody had ever really mapped it before. When you map it, what you see are these like blooms of toxic air. Like, it's actually really cool. And the data is actually modeled based off of like wind patterns and emissions that the companies submit to the government. And so after the 2019 project, the folks on my team were like, we should do this for the whole country. It would be really complicated, but like we could do it. And so the problem with 2020 was that 2020 was 2020, and there were all sorts of other pressing issues like COVID to attend to. Not to mention, police violence and like all sorts of other things. But in 2021, we came back to that project and used essentially Google supercomputing power called Google BigQuery to chew through billions of rows of data and not only analyze this data for the country, but map it at a level where anybody could look up their neighborhood essentially and see whether they were being exposed to toxic chemicals from industrial plants near them. And then we took that data, and as we were talking about, sort of identified areas for people to go down to and report out that information. We also did something really cool, which is we have a thing called the engagement team at ProPublica, and they think of really interesting ways to get communities engaged with our journalism. And they sent flyers to all of the like really heavily exposed areas, like postcards. And then we hired people to put flyers up in places like libraries saying like, learn more about the possible cancer risks from industrial plants near you. And that got like a really good amount of community engagement out of it. So much so that like a mayor in, I think, Verona, Mississippi? A mayor in one of the cities we reported on got together, the town and EPA administrators and sort of like yelled at them until they got monitors installed in their community very recently. And so that sort of engagement with the community can really lead to like interesting impacts.
Yeah, wow, I can see why you have won an award on it now. And I think that's really important to make something so visual that really everyone can understand. And then take it a step further by trying to get people interacting with it. Just seems like such a cool way to go about it. So yeah, where did the idea come from? Was it something that you've heard about before and you were like, we really need to get on this?
Yeah, well, it was, again, the Times, I think it was the Times-Picayune in Louisiana, had this idea in 2019 sort of for this cancer rally, like can we sort of like use data to report out the sort of toxic air and cancer problems in this area in Louisiana. And once we had sort of found this data and realized we could map it, then we realized like, let's blow this up and do it for the whole country.
Yeah, so you put data out in digestible ways for the world to see. How do you gauge audience reception and impact of your work?
Yeah, impact is sort of like it's a squishy thing to measure, right? Like you could say, like I said, that community got air monitors, right? And like that was pretty direct impact from our reporting. In Cancer Alley, in the 2019 story, we reported on a petrochemical plant, a multi-billion-dollar petrochemical plant that was going to be moving into there. And again, this was like one of the most cancer-like industrial toxic areas in the country, and another multi-billion-dollar petrochemical plant was going to open there. And it's hard to say whether this was like entirely based off of our reporting or not, but the residents there sued and definitely cited our reporting and our investigations on it, and that plant is no longer opening there. And so can we say that was like impact from our project? Like probably, but like who knows ultimately like what the decisions and factors were that went into that. Another thing is just readership, right? Like measuring how many people like click on something or like read a page or share it on social media, whether members of Congress write letters about something or attempt to or write a law that they attempt to pass based off of something that we write. So impact can come in all sorts of different ways. Mm-hmm.
But it seems like you do it really because you're interested in it. It's something that you enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we enjoy, and it's like an injustice that you sort of see in the world. And like a nice thing about working at a place like ProPublica, sort of a place where we can do investigative and sort of, public interest reporting, is that we get to say like, hey, we found this injustice in the world. Like, let's spend some time writing about it. And our bosses are like, great, that's our job. That's why people give us money to do this.
Yeah, and it makes me think, not all heroes wear capes, some of them work at ProPublica, so.
Listen, can you cut that and I'll send it to the bosses?
Yeah. Anyway, so for our last question, what would you want aspiring investigative journalists to know?
Oh boy. I think that there's a place for it. Like there's a real hunger for this kind of reporting in the world. We get letters and feedback and stuff from people when we put, investigative reporting out, where they say, like I said earlier, like I've always thought this, and now you're putting it into words, and like this has always been a problem for my community, and it's so wonderful to see somebody taking this seriously and to show like what this problem is, and it's like really rewarding work. It's not the only work they can do. Like I said, like going to city council meetings and stuff like that and reporting on stuff in your community is super impactful work as well. And like, I don't want to give the impression that investigative reporting is like the only like awesome reporting that you can do, but it's really nice to be able to like get the time and the space to work on projects like that. If it's something that you're interested in, I think what I always tell people, I've taught investigative reporting classes before, and I tell people like, you should be curious about the world as a journalist, and especially as an investigative journalist, and you should see things that you're interested in the world today that you're just walking around and saying like, hey, I wonder what the deal is with that. And you should just start looking into it and see what you find. File some public records, like talk to some people, and you'll really never know what shakes out.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I feel like it's similar in the research area, at least in grad school, because you're kind of taught to be the social scientist and go out and ask questions and kind of understand the things going on out there. So I think that's really great. Well, thank you so much for your insight, and really thank you for coming down here and talking to us and telling us about all the great work that you do.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
And thank you, viewers, for joining us. Until next time, good night.